Hey everybody, you're listening to episode 13 of From Guns to Keyboards. Quick news recap. We have three main areas we're going to talk about today. The first is, we'll start from south to north. First will be in Gaza. Israel got a real round of great news at the rescue of 4 hostages that happened last Saturday due to a combined effort from both the Yamam, the Shin Bet, and regular army forces as well. It was a hugely celebratory and emotional day in Israel, I think. It was finally some good news that the Israelis have been dying to hear. And we'll just be discussing more about that and what the wider implications of this could mean for the Gaza war. Meanwhile, the day after that happened, within Israel proper, Benny Gantz decided to leave the government war council. He had given Netanyahu a 3-week time period, saying that he would leave if certain changes hadn't been made. Day after he made that statement, Netanyahu basically said, go for it, and so he did. Benny Gantz is no longer in the war cabinet. We have pressure now from Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich now pushing Netanyahu to allow them into the war cabinet instead. So it's a lot of news there. Big implication for what that could mean for the war, what that could mean for wider support for Israel in the world, and what that might mean for domestic politics as well. And then in the north, things have been heating up, literally and figuratively, as Hezbollah has been launching rockets specifically targeted towards natural areas, trees, brushes, and the like, causing massive fires throughout the Galilee and northern Israel. Firefighter teams have been battling these blazes now for the better part of 2 weeks. It does appear that, according to U.S. estimates at least, that Israel is preparing the ground as well within southern Lebanon for a full-out invasion. We'll talk a little bit more about that as well, and whether we think that war will or will not in fact happen. So, with that being said, should we want to go good news, bad news, good news? How do you want to start this one?
I think we should start out with the good news.
Good news first. We'll start on a light note. So, yes, 4 hostages were rescued in, quite frankly, an astounding operation.
Yeah.
The details of which were actually finally released to the public. And it is, anyone who's familiar with the show Facto, I think, will recognize some of the tactics being involved here. You had undercover agents going in several weeks before, disguised as Gazan refugees from Rafah, going into the Nusayrat refugee camp, mingling with local Gazans there, purchasing an apartment nearby with the building where one of the hostages was held, basically going around, doing their shopping throughout the area, mapping out the apartments where the hostages were being kept. This was taken for about 2.5 weeks. Finally, the Yamam got the order to begin preparing. They prepared for about 3 days for an all-out assault. And when the day finally came, they proceeded. Noah Garami was one of the women who was rescued. She has very much become one of the faces, I think, of a lot of the hostages. I think pretty much everybody remembers at this point the video of her on October 7th being carried off on a motorcycle while she's reaching out for her boyfriend, begging, don't kill me. She's very much become the face of a lot of a symbol of the hostages. Her mother in particular also made waves. She's dying from terminal brain cancer, and one of her last wishes was to see Noah again before she passed away. And that wish did come true. Her and her daughter met in Ichilov. So that mission went off as intended. The mission for the other 3 men, however, hit a bit of a snag. So from what we understand, either the morning of or the night before, 30 Hamas fighters had gone into that building for whatever reason, unclear exactly why they were there, but the Yamam units were not expecting to see them. As a result, fierce fighting ensued within the building. Nun Zamora, one of the commanders of this unit, was killed in the fighting. He was injured at the time. He died later in the hospital. But essentially, all reports indicate that this unit came under heavy fire within the buildings. They were able to fight their way through to where the hostages were being held. They were locked in a time in a bathroom. They were able to rescue them and bring them and Zamora, basically carrying them through alleyways into an awaiting vehicle, got into the vehicle. As they began driving, the vehicle stalled. at which time the entire unit came under attack from a massive Hamas rapid response force. As a result, they were forced to switch to Plan B, which involved massive aerial strikes from the Israeli Air Force, demolishing buildings. Oftentimes, according to reports, some of these explosions were up to 10 meters away from the Israeli forces and the hostages. Ultimately, they were able to get everyone securely to the helicopter, which was awaiting them, evacuated them. Sadly, Zamora did not survive the encounter. He did pass away in Israel within the hospital. And in his honor, the mission was named after him. But the 4 hostages arriving was a moment of pure celebration, I think, in Israel. Again, there's famous video of a lifeguard announcing it to a crowded beach of Tel Avivians. For that day, at least, I think Israel just felt elated. But of course, like with all things in this war, there were major political implications, humanitarian implications, and before long, the politics came back in, and Israel was forced to kind of reckon with this operation that left somewhere between 100 to 250 Palestinians dead, depending on whose numbers you believe.
Yeah, so I want to take what you said and really dissect it, because the operation itself really can be broken down into all those factors that you mentioned, the humanitarian angle, the political angle, the international angle. But I think I first want to look at the domestic angle. I think for Israel, after everything that happened on October 7th, it needed this moment where it got its mojo back. It needed this moment where,
yeah, for sure,
where it kind of just proved to itself and proved to the world that it's still capable of Operation Entebbe-like ventures against its enemies in order to save its hostages. And I think for months now, the Israeli public was waiting for some sort of moment like this. You've mentioned in previous episodes, and rightly so, that Israelis are not used to losing. Israelis are brought up on stories of the victorious Israel Defense Forces and the all-powerful Israel Security Forces. And October 7th until today has been this nonstop experience of Israel really reckoning with not only a surprise attack from Hamas, but also a largely unsatisfactory military offensive in the Gaza Strip. So I think that this moment from a domestic perspective for Israel was, in addition to the amazing elation that we all felt from bringing back these 4 hostages, was also a moment where Israelis said, we got this. We're back.
There's a famous moment too where Noah reunites with her father, and he says, "Ez tzava yesh lanu," like, what an army we have. And I think it's the first time in almost 8 months that any of us have really said that to each other. Maybe at the beginning with the activation of 300,000 reservists. What a country we have, that 300,000 men and women oftentimes from all over the globe even, would come back to Israel in order to prepare for an invasion. So yes, there was certain. I read in a news article that it described as a shot in the arm, and that's exactly how I would describe it. It was a shot in the arm for the Israelis. We really desperately needed this moment. It was a huge boost in morale. However, I think we need to then discuss the sort of other side of this coin as well, because at the end of the day, this reinvigorated on 2 sides a little bit the question of the hostages. On the one hand, a lot of proponents for ending the war as quickly as possible, within Israel even, for ending the war as quickly as possible and getting the hostages back, was look at this feeling that we have now with just 4 people back. If we want to get them all back, this idea that we can continue with military operations is a fantasy for many. And I, quite frankly, I'd have to agree. I think Hamas is at the time, we were all shocked to see, number one, that the hostages were in residential homes, that they appeared quite, physically at least, quite healthy. Noah described that she was basically working as a cleaning lady in the home that she was in, which actually makes sense from a psychological perspective, because you don't want people to just sit around all day and do nothing. If you give them something to do, they're much more, it's much healthier from a psychological standpoint, even if it's something like cleaning a house. It certainly seemed like a much better image than I think we had in our heads of the hostages sort of sitting in a dark, dank tunnel without sunlight for now almost 9 months. But at the same time, I think now Hamas really will have no other choice but to bring everybody underground, where it's much harder for the Israelis to do operations that can cause their rescue.
Well, it's funny that you mentioned that, because I would have expected that Hamas would have already made this decision, because this is the second military operation where Israel retrieved hostages that were held above ground. The other
well-known operation that happened not too long ago before the retrieval of these 4 hostages was another 2 Israeli hostages that were retrieved out of Rafiah, and they were also held in residential complexes. So I don't know. What you're saying is very logical and makes a lot of sense. From Hamas's perspective, this is now the second time where they've held hostages above ground and they lost footing and they were not successful in keeping the hostages. So logic would dictate that they would have to bring them underground. I wonder why they didn't do it after the first failure that they experienced.
Yeah, my guess would be something logistical. That's the only thing I can really think of. It's from all reports, Hamas, I think, was surprised at the number of hostages they did receive, and my guess is they just weren't prepared for it. And I think it also comes with maybe trying to keep them spread out a bit, especially from each other. But you're right. Also, by the way, yes, we have these are successful operations that we're intimately familiar of, but ultimately there have been failed operations as well within houses too. And so Hamas probably sees these failed operations and says to themselves, okay, the risk of them, the odds of them actually being able to bring somebody out are extremely low. Whether or not it's unclear within these past failed operations, whether or not the hostages were killed by Hamas gunmen or by Aaron's Israeli bullets. But it appears as though, for Hamas, the risk, I guess, is low enough or comfortable enough for them to be able to leave the hostages above ground. But I think they really saw that quite frankly, this was very much the morale boost that the Israelis needed, because for months, I think we even talked about it last episode, we described that this is the lowest point in the war that we've been in since October 8th, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. And going off of what you mentioned a second ago about whether or not these military operations can be repeated ad nauseum in order to bring back all the hostages, I think you're right. I think that the Israeli army, as powerful as it is and as sophisticated as its abilities are, especially what we saw with this rescue operation, will not be able to bring back all of the hostages through military means. The only way to bring back a significant number of hostages probably will be through a deal. I don't see any other way of going about it. Of course, we have to discuss what are our limits in a deal, what are our red lines, how far are we willing to go, and all that is fair discussion. But I agree with you on your point that I really don't see a way that Israel can just through military operations bring back everybody that is being held hostage in Gaza. That being said, I also am not entirely sure that a deal with Hamas will bring back all of the hostages. I think that while a deal will probably bring back a lot more hostages than non-stop military operations to bring back hostages here and there in a pinpointed way, I believe that we are slowly starting to learn about Hamas that they themselves don't exactly know where all the hostages are and what their status is. Hamas being now what was once a highly centralized terrorist organization broken down into a much more decentralized guerrilla force in the Gaza Strip, I don't think that Hamas is fully aware of the state of the hostages, where the hostages are, and what their health status is as of right now. And B, I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of the hostages got lost along the way within the Gaza Strip during the chaos of October 7th and everything that happened after that. And they are missing persons that are currently not, that the Israeli army and Hamas are unable to successfully locate. And, just to kind of parallel this to the Israeli example, Israel, until not too long ago, was still looking for its own missing people from October 7th within Israeli territory from October 7th until today, meaning that Israel, supposedly a highly advanced Western country that should have record of all its people and know where all its people were, still for months has been facing a situation where it wasn't entirely certain about who was taken hostage, who's missing, still uncovering bodies. You still hear reports here and there about bodies of both Hamas members and of Israelis being uncovered in Otef Aza in the Gaza envelope. So if that's the situation in Israel proper, where we're still uncovering these sorts of things, I would not be surprised if a certain number of hostages are also in the Gaza Strip, but not in Hamas hands, quote unquote, and have kind of gone missing during the course of
these battles between Israel and Hamas.
To your point, actually, a week ago, where they published a news story saying that someone who had been presumed taken hostage, their body was sadly found here in Israel.
In Israel, exactly.
Yeah, and it seems like every week almost we get another report, and recently in the weeks, getting another news report saying that this person who we thought was a hostage actually died on October 7th. We've confirmed their death. I think you're right. I think whether or not Hamas knows or doesn't know where the hostages are, they seem to be kind of laying the ground of not releasing all of them in any sort of a deal, that they can either say that they don't know where they are and lie about it and withhold people, or that they legitimately don't know, as you said.
I think that it also somewhat suits them because once they give up all the hostages, they lose all of their leverage with the Israeli government. And this, sometimes we talk about this in negotiations, that one of the strongest negotiating points is reflecting to the other side what you are completely unable to do. It's not a question of motivation. It's not a question of will. It's just a question of ability, that no matter how much the other side wants, you as the negotiating partner are saying, there's nothing I can do. I genuinely have no knowledge about the subject and I can't give you what you want. So I think that this situation between Israel and Hamas largely suits Hamas. And it also plays into what we saw with Biden's proposal that was released not too long ago, that we also discussed in one of our recent episodes, where Biden released to the world an Israeli proposal to bring about an end to the war through a long-term ceasefire. And the proposal, cited as Israeli by Biden, went further than any other Israeli proposal to bring about an end to the war, and largely reflected what Hamas had proposed to the Israelis for months after months, and the Israelis had rejected. Meaning it was, in many ways, you could say something of Israel giving up to almost all of Hamas's major demands, saying that we are willing to end the war without an explicit reference to the removal of Hamas from the Gaza Strip. We will get all the hostages back once we...
Well, no, that was the one sticking point that Israelis did not concede on, which they are not willing to end the war. They're willing to do at least a 6-week ceasefire. Hamas wants a firm commitment that's been guaranteed by the international community that Israel will end the war, and that doesn't appear to be something Israelis are willing to do.
But I'm only referring to what Biden reflected. What Biden reflected in the media, afterwards there was all sorts of statements, you're correct. There was all sorts of statements by Israeli media and by Israeli politicians that Israel is only willing to accept certain parts of the proposal and what have you. I'm referring to the Biden proposal. I'm referring to...
what he came out of Biden's mouth.
What Biden said was, we are reflecting an Israeli deal in this statement, which will start out with the 6-week ceasefire, like you mentioned, and will extend from there into a further and permanent ceasefire where all the hostages are returned and the war will come to an end. And even that proposal, which goes further, like I said, than any other Israeli proposal, and even if it's not an Israeli proposal, let's just say it's a Biden proposal, Hamas rejected it and gave such significant revisions to the proposal that the American State Department responded to these revisions and said that what Hamas is asking for is completely unacceptable. Meaning this goes beyond good faith negotiations of two parties that are trying to come to the negotiating table. From even the American perspective, it's very clear that Hamas is playing a game here where they're not really interested in a deal. And all this really ties back into the conversation we were having a second ago about what does Hamas know about the hostages. I think that Sinvar is playing this game here where he's very comfortable continuing the situation as it is. He knows that the longer he stretches out this war, the Israelis will inevitably tire out and leave the Gaza Strip. He has no interest in reaching a deal. The military pressure on him is currently not strong enough in order to reach a diplomatic deal with the Israelis. And for all those reasons, I think that we're most likely not going to see a deal in the foreseeable future. And if we do, it's going to be very limited.
Well, I would say any deal that doesn't include a permanent end of the war, Hamas is going to outright reject, which makes total sense from their perspective. They have no sense in giving up the hostages only for the Israelis to then reinvade, gloves off, because there's no more hostages for them to potentially harm as they go towards Hamas. Without something like that in the works, then yeah, I don't blame... If I were Hamas, I also wouldn't accept that deal.
Right, and also adding on to that, I think Hamas realizes that that would inevitably be what would happen because they cannot adhere to the terms of the deal, meaning that if the terms of the deal are Hamas returns all the hostages over an extended period of time, and in return Israel ends the war, Hamas knows that it cannot reach those conditions. Why? Because it doesn't know where all the hostages are. So what will inevitably happen is Hamas will return up to hostage number 90 or 100. There will be another, for example, 20 hostages left in the Gaza Strip that will not be returned because Hamas has no idea where they are. And Israel, at least from Hamas's perspective, can use this as kind of a reason to go back into war in the Gaza Strip and continue the fighting. They know that Israel has this legitimacy built into the deal that they can use later on to continue the fighting. And as we discussed, this will kind of inevitably incentivizes Hamas to not agree to a deal at any stage with the Israelis.
Do you think the Israeli government is interested in the deal?
I think that it depends on who you look at the Israeli government. The far-right members of Israel's cabinet, Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, are definitely not interested in a deal. I think they look at this as basically just a failure of Israel's military operations in the Gaza Strip if Israel agrees to a deal with the devil, quote unquote. Bibi, you never know with him. I don't think Bibi, and we've discussed this in previous episodes, in my opinion at least, I don't see Bibi as a particularly ideological prime minister, even though, as we've discussed, that he has mentioned in his autobiography that he's a revisionist Zionist with all sorts of deep ideology about the Iron Wall, and he's
an ideologue about himself, but beyond that, it's tough to say.
I don't see Bibi as this very ideological figure. I think Bibi will make a decision based on cold politics, and I think that if at a certain point Bibi realizes that the best thing he needs to support his coalition is to make a deal, then he'll do it. If not, he won't. And currently, it looks like he can't cut a deal with the opposition that would bring Smotrich and Ben-Gvir out and bring in Lapid and Gantz. So it looks like Bibi has no choice but to not agree to a deal. But like I said, for Bibi, it's all politics. If tomorrow the situation changes, then he'll sign on a deal in a second.
Well, on that note, let's actually move over to Israeli politics, because that was the next big story. So the day after the hostage release, Gantz, who had intended to make his speech say that he was going to be leaving the War Council and the extended government, on the day of the hostage release, decided to postpone it by 24 hours. I kind of look at this move in two ways. On the one, I want to say, like, wow, what character this man has to allow Israel to celebrate this moment of unity. Of course, on the other hand, there is certainly a cynical political ploy here. He needed that headline. He needed this departure from the government to make an impact. But either way, he's out of the war cabinet. The National Unity Party has now left the coalition, and quite frankly, I'm very also torn on this as well. Just like I'm kind of torn on Benny Gantz as a politician in general. On the one hand, I politically, he needed to do this, right? If he wants any hope for a political future, he needed to leave the Netanyahu government. I think if he wanted to make a true domestic impact, I think even you said it a couple episodes ago, he should have left 3 months ago. He waited way too long in this time. And actually, the poll numbers reflect that, too. I think he's lost they did a poll recently now that he left the coalition. His numbers have dropped by about 3 or 4 seats if we were to hold elections today. So on the one hand, I do believe that it comes from a place where he truly believes that Netanyahu does not have, as you said, real ideological interest for this war and is just operating on a pure political calculus. On the other hand, though, I have to say not having him in the room, kind of like having the adults in the room, sort of preventing Bibi from indulging in his worst tendencies. It's concerning. It's concerning now that Gantz will not be there to rein Bibi in, that he will not be able to use his career as former Army Chief of Staff and the experience that brings in order to help navigate the war. I'm concerned that, had he not been there in the first place, this war might have become even more tragic than it currently is today if Netanyahu had nobody to listen to but his far-right coalition. That instead of, depending on the numbers you believe, 20,000, 30, 40,000 Gazans killed in this war, a number could be triple that or worse, or Israel might have already opened a second front, or who knows. But it's certainly concerning. I guess the question that the biggest question is, what kind of impact do we think this is going to have, if any, on Israeli policy?
Well, I think the immediate impact will be that, like you said, there will no longer be that responsible adult that will restrain the Israeli Prime Minister from doing things that he normally would have done had he only listened to his right-wing coalition partners. I do think, though, that towards the end, and Gantz kind of referenced this in his speech and in press conferences that he gave after him leaving the coalition, his influence over Bibi slowly started to go down in recent months. And a lot of policy points that he tried to bring about in the war cabinet were being largely ignored. For instance, the invasion of Rafiah, which was supposed to happen months ago, was delayed and delayed and delayed against Gantz's recommendation and against the recommendation of much of the army. And it was very clear to Gantz that Bibi was just doing whatever he can to basically string out this war as long as possible and keep an excuse to stay in power as long as possible. And Gantz realized that he became something of an irrelevant member of this war cabinet. So I think you're right about the whole responsible adult in the room thing. I agree with you. But, when you have using your metaphor, when you have a rebellious kid that's not willing to listen to his parent, there's only so much that you can do at a certain point. And, this is kind of the closest thing to tough love that you can possibly give.
So removing that facade even of unity.
Right, removing that facade of unity that in recent months has largely been non-existent in the war cabinet. Multiple reports of the war cabinet being convened or major decisions being made without Benny Gantz, without consulting him, even despite his vast experience in the security realm. A lot of people said after October 7th that Bibi is finished politically, that he has no way of continuing, that this is the end for him, and that he's going to go home, and that's that. And we see that we're almost a year on from the beginning of this war, and Bibi is hanging on strong, and his poll numbers, which were originally terrible, are starting to improve a little bit. And I wouldn't be surprised if we see a continuation of Bibi's rule for the foreseeable future, both in this current Knesset and in the following Knesset. It would not surprise me if that happens. And we have to see how all this plays out. Currently, I don't see any easy way in which the coalition collapses in the coming months. And if the coalition doesn't collapse in the coming months, we're kind of just going to see a continuation of existing government policy.
No, absolutely not. I mean, I think Benny Gantz's hope was that he would leave the government and this would result in massive street protests, similar to what we saw during the judicial reform a year ago prior to October 7th. That hasn't really materialized. I don't expect it to really materialize either at this point. Israelis seem to be in the mentality of, we really can't have elections during wartime. It's just too chaotic and the government needs to focus solely on the war. And not only that, but I just don't think that I have a theory that the Israeli left in Israel is not terribly good at grassroots organization. It's kind of the opposite in the United States. In the United States, you see left-wing Americans are extraordinarily good at grassroots organizing and bringing people out of the street and protesting for whatever issue they want to protest. Whereas now we actually see conservatives who feel like they're kind of the minority in their country now are horrible at organizing, because conservatism by nature is kind of defending the establishment. And so they haven't really had a need to organize. In the Israel situation's kind of reversed. The left has enjoyed power for so long that they don't really have that long tradition of organization that they can really bring to the streets. We saw with the judicial reform that many Israelis did go out, but they didn't really come out as an organized movement so much as you saw you had Kaplan Force in Tel Aviv, which is an organization for sure, but most people out there protesting were not really part of this centralized group, this small centralized group. And in fact, many people, if you just go along the highways, you would see people going out and protesting. And now you see, as a result of this war, I think you see a lot of Israelis who are very much torn. And I think you actually described it perfectly when you talk about Hamas and this deal, which is, look, even if we want a deal, which many, of course, if I think if there was a solid deal to bring back the hostages for limited concessions from the Israelis, I think that there might be major pressure for that to happen. But Hamas believes that they can get everything they want out of this deal and potentially more. And so I think a lot of Israelis kind of recognize that and say, well, how can I trust these people? Yes, we want the hostages back, but how can we make a deal with them? And beyond that, as I was saying, the left in Israel just doesn't have the grassroots organization to make that happen. And the idea that you're going to organize during wartime as well it's extremely difficult, I think. And as a result, Benny Gantz's departure, I think, had really no effect on the Israeli populace.
I agree with you, and I also think that the way in which Benny Gantz left the coalition was pathetic. I think that, and I'm not saying that he was wrong to leave the coalition. I think that he did what his moral compass told him to do, but I think that the way he went about it was perceived as very pathetic. And, for example, it really started out when, for weeks already, there were rumors that Gantz wanted to leave the coalition or he should leave the coalition, and he wasn't. So there was kind of this opinion starting to be brought up that Gantz is too afraid to leave the coalition, and he was waiting too long to make a move. He ultimately makes a move after all these rumors are being spread about Gantz that he's not strong enough to stand on his own and leave the coalition. And the move that he makes is coming out with this dull statement saying that we're going to leave the coalition by June 8th, I believe the deadline was. If Bibi doesn't agree to all sorts of concessions. I think the speech came across as very political and non-inspiring, and it wasn't clear what exactly this June 8th deadline was and why exactly he picked this weird June deadline. And
why he waited so long to leave the coalition.
Right, or why he did it through an ultimatum. It just seemed so political and so artificial and so not from the heart. I think that, you mentioned the comparison to Gallant, how the firing of Gallant last year brought about mass protests. And I think that the difference between the two is the Gallant event really seemed like this very emotional politician that deeply cares about his country, that deeply wants to bring about change, being removed from power by the bad guys. And Gantz, who I do think is a great guy, and I voted for Gantz, and I really do appreciate him as a politician, I think he came across as too political in the way that he went about this resignation. And then, ultimately leaving the government, then you had, it happened, the day that he was supposed to leave was the day that the rescues of the hostages happened.
Right.
And he had to push off his press conference because it just wasn't good timing. And, the entire way in which he left the government didn't bring about the sort of mass-inspiring feeling of change that we felt when Gantz was fired last year.
Well, I mean, at the end of the day, Gantz has always had the problem of being one of the least charismatic politicians that you've had in the Knesset at this time. And he's going up against one of the most charismatic politicians in all of Israeli history. So he's not the kind of symbol that you can really rally around. I mean, Gantz, if he was just even a little bit more charismatic, and as you said, if he just spoke from the heart, he really had these ideas that he was kind of bringing to the surface, I think he would really be a strong rallying point for most of Israelis who are tired of the same, of kind of Bibi and his cynicism and his politics and all these issues. But at the end of the day, I mean, Gantz and Bibi really kind of have the same political ideas. It's just that Bibi can speak to a crowd and Gantz cannot. Yeah. And I have to say, too, in regards to the June 8th deadline and the rescue of the hostages, I don't know. I mentioned kind of in my review of the Bibi book that he wrote about himself that Netanyahu kind of has this messiah complex. I feel like that he has this messiah complex. And I have to say, he's probably the luckiest politician in the world. And if I was as lucky as him, I would also probably think that God just loved me and that I should just keep doing whatever I'm doing, because you're absolutely right. The fact that happened on the day of the hostage rescue, unbelievable. I mean, look, at the end of the day, the order was given by Netanyahu, so you kind of do have to wonder if, could they have done it the day before and he pushed it? Again, you can kind of go down the conspiracy rabbit hole, but whatever exactly happened, like, it was definitely amazing timing for Bibi and horrible timing for Gantz.
For Gantz, yeah.
Anyway, so moving on to another major issue, I think, in Israeli society is the passing of the first reading in the Knesset of the Haredi draft bill. Michael, can you just explain that bill real quick?
Yeah, so basically, just to remind the status quo in Israel, all Israelis, once they reach roughly the age of 18, are supposed to draft to the Israeli army. There are some Israelis that are not asked to draft, including Israeli Arabs that are not sent a draft notice when they reach the age of 18, but by and large, if you are Israeli, you reach the age of 18, you are given a draft notice and you have to draft. And that includes Israel's Haredi population, Israel's ultra-orthodox Jewish population. They also receive draft notices like everybody else as they get closer to the age of 18, and also are requested to draft into the Israeli army. Now, according to the current status quo, the Haredim, once they reach the age of 18, have the ability to push off their draft, and as opposed to going into the army, can instead study at yeshiva, study Torah 24/7, as opposed to doing the normal route of military service. And the way it works, at least from a bureaucratic perspective, is, let's say I'm an 18-year-old Haredi man that is requested to go into the army. I get my notice, I tell the army that I'm planning on studying in a yeshiva for the foreseeable future, and I get a deferral for a year. And basically what Israeli men do today, or Haredi Israeli men do today, is every year they go back and they extend their deferral 1 year, 1 year, 1 year, until they reach an age of exemption where they no longer need to continue to defer their service, and they can just not.
The age now is 26, I believe, correct?
The age is 26. So basically, Haredim kind of like do this thing where, like, you know, they're asked to serve in the army at 18. They're like, no, I'm studying in yeshiva. They're like, okay, we'll get back to you when you're 19. They get back to them when they're 19. No, I'm still studying. And then they just keep pushing it off year by year by year by year by year. And then they get to the age of 26.
This also, by the way, has major negative trickle-down effects economically on the Haredi community, because essentially Haredis have to be in yeshiva until they're 26. They can't go to university. They can't start working until after the age of 26.
Exactly. You are forbidden, because you technically should have been in the army during this time that you're learning Torah. You are forbidden from working in other professions. So this kind of keeps a lot of Haredi men in the cycle of poverty that continues for a while. And then once you reach the age of 26, according to the current law, you could basically not ask for a continuing deferral. You can just be exempt from military service, and you can continue on with your life from the age of 26. If you want to continue studying in yeshiva, you can. If you want to go out and work, you can. And that's basically the situation that is currently we are currently seeing in the state of Israel today. It's the status quo in Israel today.
So what is this bill then supposed to change?
Now, the bill is supposed to do several things. The first thing that it's going to do is lower the exemption age from 26 to 21, meaning that a Haredi man that is requested to serve in the army at the age of 18 will only have to ask for approximately 3 one-year referrals, and then by the age of 21 can already leave and be fully exempted from service. There's also some sort of reference to all sorts of efforts that seem to be largely dull and not worth getting into, to slowly integrate Haredi men into the army, all sorts of economic incentives and disincentives to bring Haredim into the army. Not even worth getting into, because I don't see this really bringing about any sort of significant change. It looks like largely making the public happy, or at least the stupid public happy, in terms of the demand to draft Haredim into the army. The most significant thing is really the lowering of the draft age from 26 to 21. And here there's a major moral dilemma for a lot of the Israeli public, where on the one hand, the lowering of the draft age from 26 to 21 is great from an economic perspective, because it gives Haredim the ability to leave their Torah studies at an earlier age and integrate into the workforce at the age of 21 already. And this is something that many members of the opposition who voted against the bill had for years supported bringing about anyway. On the other hand, it somewhat formalizes the situation in which Haredim will never have to serve in the army, because if you can just, by the age of 21, be fully exempt, you're basically giving a blank check for every Haredi to just do 3 years in yeshiva, and then from there go ahead and join the workforce and not share the burden with the rest of the Israeli public.
Coming at a time, too, where the Knesset is expected to, in the future, pass more laws increasing the amount of service time that reserve soldiers must serve, how often they can be called up, how many days per year they're going to serve, and that also includes the regular army, by the way, increasing their service as well. So on the one hand, you have a section of the Israeli economy and the Israeli society that really feels like, wow, we're carrying a massive burden here. Whereas, as Michael, as you said, the Haredi, meanwhile, are given lower and lower deferments. I really want to go on to the north real quick, but before we do, I just have a quick question to ask you, because, at the end of the day, I think you and I are kind of experiencing this a little bit in our own lives, where we're coming back to work and we're looking around and we're starting to say, wow, we went off to the IDF, we answered the call of the nation, and it doesn't appear to have come with, minus a couple stimulus checks, with real career success. And in fact, kind of the opposite, a little bit of actually kind of being held back in your career a little bit, because at the end of the day, you might get called up very soon, or I think I have my return date for back to the IDF at the end of this year. And so for someone like me and for some of my fellow reservists who are now back in the office, how can you put someone like us on like a 6-month project, for instance, when they might be gone for a year, for a month or 2 months out of that 6 months? A lot of, I think, reservists are coming back feeling a little frustrated at on the one hand, the being the soldiers that Israel needed, on the other hand, having it really negatively affect their career, and not just them, I would add, but the spouses who stayed behind as well. The Knesset finally passed a law, I think just a few weeks ago, far too late in my opinion, that the spouses of reserve soldiers, many of whom were fired, because at the end of the day, their husbands or sometimes their wives are gone, they're alone at home with the kids, and they're expected to work a full-time job. It's extremely difficult, and many of them weren't able to do it, especially at a time at the beginning of the war where all the daycares were closed. Finally, the Knesset passed a law saying that these people cannot be fired either. Just like you can't fire reserve soldiers for going into the IDF, now you also can't fire their spouses. My question and my curiosity is, what kind of societal effects do you foresee in the long-term future of having such a large portion of Israeli society in this sort of like Spartan-esque type society where they can be called up at any moment and are regularly called up to fight as soldiers?
It's limbo. It's this feeling of endless limbo where you're always in this middle state of not being 100% in the office or back in civilian life, and not being 100% back in the army. You have 1 foot in the door, 1 foot out. And I'm not even talking just about myself. I'm talking about, I think, the feeling of much of the reserve population that I speak with and that I interact with. And, it's a very difficult situation, because I can, on the one hand, very much understand many Israeli employers that are, at the end of the day, no matter how you want to cut the cake and no matter how patriotic they may or may not be, they still have to make money, and they still have to bring in those paychecks at the end of the month, or pay those paychecks at the end of the month somehow. And they are trying to figure out how to navigate the situation. So I'm not overly judging a lot of these employers. I can understand the tension that comes when a reservist has to suddenly leave for 6 months, and how does that affect things at the company. But at the same time, it's not exactly something that the reservist himself has any control over. The reservist is doing what is legally expected of him to do. He's being forced to leave his life, to leave his or her family at home, and to go out and fight for his country. And, when I look at it from an economic perspective, I do see that there is an effort to give all sorts of grants to reservists and to make the situation easier for them, and to give all sorts of like special benefits to reservists to thank them for their service. But at the end of the day, I think that the real challenge here is really the psychological one of how do you give reservists the sense of psychological comfort that they need to find in this state of limbo, because no person could feel that he's bringing about the best of himself when he's constantly has 1 foot in the door, 1 foot out, and is constantly in the state of limbo between these two worlds.
It's definitely hard to feel like it's 100% at work, and it's hard to feel like you're able to truly commit to anything long term if, as you said, you're in this limbo between two worlds. For myself, I'm also just very curious about just sort of the long-term political and societal restructure that might take place. I remember speaking to my boss, and my boss kind of making a very interesting point where she's like, look, a lot of women go on maternity leave. Excuse me. A lot of women go on maternity leave, and that can negatively impact their careers. Like it's as much as companies try not to let it happen, it does happen.
It happens.
By the way, not necessarily because the company is against them or malicious. It's just things kind of move on, and promotions come around when they're on maternity leave, and they're not there to receive them. There are a lot of new laws in place to protect women and new mothers who are going off, and that will most likely come into place for reserve soldiers as well, but it's going to happen very slowly. And when I say when I'm curious about the political and societal restructure in this response, I kind of look at, just historically speaking, whenever a state or a nation or an empire or whatever happens to need a specific kind of soldier or specific whatever kind of weapon that they're using at the time, the person behind that generally tends to see a lot of political power. If we want to take it all the way back to early history, we can talk about the chariot being on the battlefield, and the chariot was the weapon system of the day in the Middle and Late Bronze Age. Whoever had the most chariots, they won the wars, they won the battles, but chariots are very expensive. And as a result, we see in ancient societies that power was very much sanctioned at the top. It was an incredibly aristocratic society. Whereas we move into, and the same can be said for, let's say, medieval Europe, knights on horseback, or medieval Persian Empire. Meanwhile, if we look at the Greeks, and the phalanx system meant that Greek citizens generally had a lot of political power within the polis system. Bring it back to more modern times. If you want to look at, for instance, World War I and World War II. World War II, the U.S. called up about how many 10 or 20 million men in order to fight. And coming back, these men received grants from the GI Bill, free university, subsidized housing. You really saw that the nation realized that they needed these people.
Right.
And these people kind of understood the political power that they wielded as being needed. Meanwhile, in modern warfare, things tend to be very much based around large weapons systems. And I think in Israel in particular, we saw that units like 8200, who were intelligence units, they were the ones receiving most of the economic and political power as well for a long time. They were the ones who were going off and building startups using their founded knowledge from their IDF training. And it was a very small insular group because that's what the Israelis were relying on militarily. Now that Israeli military alliance has spread to society as a whole, to a much larger group of society, I'm wondering if that's going to change. If we're going to start seeing political power being wielded by this class of people who carried much of the burden. Because at the moment, I think a lot of frustration, tying it back to the Haredi bill, is that it should be that way. It should be that the people who were fighting are now receiving the political benefits and political power. But one thing that's so frustrating with this bill is that it seems as, in fact, that people not carrying the burden are getting what they want instead.
Right. I think that, so in my opinion, I think it's a great question. In my opinion, I don't think we're going to see the sort of same movement of power to this new reservist class that we saw in other societies, or that we see in Israeli society with 8200 or other units. And I think the reason being is that even though there is still a lack of sharing of the burden with Haredi society and with certain aspects of Israeli society, the reservist class still cuts through such a wide group of Israelis from all sorts of backgrounds. And I think that the ability of this diverse group to unite behind shared political causes and shared ideas, as much as they're able to fight together on the battlefield, I see it very difficult for these same groups of people going to Knesset and arguing for specific issues that they want to bring about. There is a difference between the 8200 crowd, which, a lot of the individuals that serve in these units tend to come, not always, I don't want to generalize, but in a lot of cases, a lot of the individuals that come some of these units tend to come from the elite of Israeli society and come from families that are able to set up their kids in these units. And it's kind of this self-feeding pool of elites that are able to serve in 8200 and come out. Again, not generalizing. Many Israelis that serve in 8200 definitely got there on their own merit, but a lot don't.
Beyond that, too, they meet regularly as well, so they kind of have
right.
Like if you look at a lot of investors, they come from the same unit and they invest in sort of the junior members of the unit and build their companies.
Exactly. And again, I'm not saying to generalize, but that it is something that exists in 8200, and you have like a similar class of people that are kind of behind this group. And I think reservists, you have everybody from the national religious groups to super secular Tel Avivans from the Israeli periphery to the Israeli center. And I think that the strongest political groupings that tend to be formed are ones where the group itself is somewhat homogenous in specific, whether it's identity politics or other specific characteristics that allow it to unite behind specific issues. So I don't think we're going to see this sort of Spartan-like change that we saw in Asian societies, and that we see somewhat in Israeli society in other aspects. What I do think is important to mention from a societal perspective is whether or not this is a good thing for society, whether or not we are happy with this, that Israelis, or a significant portion of Israelis, including us too, are having one foot in the door, one foot out, going back into fighting in this war, and then all of a sudden going back to normal life and being civilians. I think, on the one hand, there's something very romantic about this reservist class that has been developed over the past more than 6 months, almost a year of fighting that we've been seeing in the Gaza Strip and in the north of Israel, which we'll get to in a second. It's very romantic to see Israelis putting aside everything they have at home and going out to defend their country and to fight for the people they love and for the people they want to defend. I don't think that we can continue doing this in a united way if all sectors of Israeli society don't come together and draft. If the Haredim and other groups that are currently not drafting into Israeli society don't join the draft and don't join their fellow Israelis, I think that the sort of romanticism that is behind the reservist class that went out to serve in the army will dissipate and be replaced by this feeling that we're just a bunch of suckers that are putting all the burden on our shoulders and are taking away the burden from those who don't have to serve at all.
I think that feeling is already very much here. It's kind of turning into a Vietnam-esque style of soldier mentality of how can I get out of this, not how can I really, give more of myself. I think that, look, there's a lot obviously I want to talk about here, and we're running low on time, so we're going to have to move on pretty soon. But I do want to say that in terms of the reservists acquiring political power, I don't think it's going to necessarily be around a political ideology. I think it's more around economic power. And if it does come about, I think it will most likely come about after the war, less likely during it. Or if the war continues to drag on, the army needs more and more reservist soldiers. I think they're going to be forced in one way or another to pass more favorable laws that are going to give more reserve soldiers more economic benefits. And essentially, my hope is, and this is obviously a bottom-up hope, that reservists will come together and form communities, even if it's just within their own teams. If it's in like team reunions and really bringing guys close together and allowing guys from different parts of Israeli society to speak as friends and brothers who went through this together in order to potentially from there grow and mobilize into something that can really be a political force to be reckoned with. As for the Haredi, I'm very torn on the Haredi issue, because on the one hand, look, I'm not sure how much I want religious fanatics fighting in what's a very what should be, in my opinion, a very surgical kind of war. I think these guys would make great warriors in the conventional sense, but we need a war that's very smart and logical, and that's done, as I've always said, and particularly in regards to Gaza, in a counterinsurgent method. And counterinsurgency, I read a book recently by Donnie O'Malley. He was a former lieutenant in Afghanistan. Hilarious guy. Very right-wing kind of humor. And he said something, and this is his words. He says in his book, he goes, counterinsurgency is gay. And what he means by that is that you can't just take the gloves off and go killing people whenever you want. You need to really choose your targets wisely, try and create as much of a connection with the local group as possible. It's difficult, and it's not something that Marines in particular, or most people who want to be soldiers, really enjoy doing, because it goes counter to a lot of their basic instincts. So having that being said, I think the symbolism of not having the Haredi serve side by side with the rest of society is going to make a lot of people feel, as you said, like suckers. And I already hear those voices within my office as well, being like, why did I go and do this? I'm not getting promoted. I'm not getting this, that. I feel like a sucker.
Yeah.
And Israelis are very sensitive, in my opinion, to feeling like they're sacrificing something and not getting something in return. I think
they're being taken advantage of.
Exactly right. I think Israelis are much more so than Americans, extremely sensitive to that kind of feeling and avoid it like the plague. All right, any last thoughts before we move on to the north?
Let's move on to the north.
Let's move on. All right, so recently we've seen major conflagrations between the Hezbollah and the IDF, much as a response to the IDF assassinating a Hezbollah division commander. Him and 3 of his aides were killed in a bombing when they were all in a home together. It is the highest ranking member of Hezbollah that has been assassinated during this war. It caused major flare-ups by Hezbollah in response to this assassination, with upwards of 30 rockets being targeted much deeper into the Galilee. I'm talking places like Tiberias and around the Sea of Galilee, places that really had been kind of spared from this war for the most part. They're now coming under regular attack, in addition to them targeting purposely forested areas, creating fires, and unintentionally as well, just the fact that you have hot metal that's been sometimes even shot out of the sky. If it lands on dried brush, it's going to ignite, and that's exactly what we've been seeing. We have firefighter teams fighting around the clock. As someone who grew up in Southern California, I can say this is a very familiar sight, watching firefighter teams battling blazing fires. And now the major question recently, today actually, the U.S. released a report saying that they see this as they see Israel as preparing to invade the north. They see a lot of brigade and battalion level training for what appears to be a northern style invasion. And most hilariously, I don't know if this may be the best way to describe it, but Israelis also burning southern Lebanon with the use of, speaking of ancient warfare, with the use of trebuchets and flaming bow and arrows. I kid you not, there are videos going around that show, honest to God, trebuchets launching flaming balls into southern Lebanon. I told Michael, I don't have the exact facts to confirm this, but I think this is probably the first time that a trebuchet has been used in a combat situation in 300 to 400 years. My jaw hit the floor when I saw that video.
We're referring to for those who don't know what a trebuchet is, we're referring to the small catapults that we were seeing.
Yeah, it's a catapult. It's able to fling objects a bit further than a catapult. It kind of spins around a little bit, creating a lot more momentum. But yes, it is a medieval siege weapon that the IDF has now employed in order to what appears to burn areas in southern Lebanon in preparation for what can only be a preparation for ground invasion. Possibly a tit for tat style, you burn our forest, we're going to burn your forest kind of thing. But I think more logically for preparing for ground invasion.
Well, look, I think that you made a lot of interesting points there. So I think we need to kind of break this down. Preparing for a ground invasion, I don't think that's anything particularly new from what we've been seeing since October 8th when Hezbollah joined the fighting. I think that a lot of what Israel has been doing from October 8th until today when Hezbollah joined the fighting and decided to launch rockets at Israel has been preparing the ground for a ground invasion, whether it was burning some areas of brush in southern Lebanon or going after the infrastructure of Redouan, the elite Hezbollah force in South Lebanon, or going after the defensive forces that are currently stationed in South Lebanon. So I do think that, when the Americans talk about this report that I also read, that Israel is preparing the ground for war, I will just point out that I think from October 8th, Israel has been slowly preparing the ground for war.
Let me clarify, an immediate ground invasion, not just a ground invasion.
Yeah, look, whether or not we're talking about an immediate ground invasion or not, that's, at the end of the day, the call of the now smaller war cabinet, Bibi and his immediate associates. Whether or not he's going to give the call to invade this week or in a few months, I think it's very clear that to all of us that a war is inevitable because there doesn't seem to be any way of reaching a deal with Hamas in Gaza, and as long as there's fighting between Israel and Hamas in the Gaza Strip, Hezbollah is not going to stop the fighting in the north, and if Hezbollah doesn't stop the fighting in the north, then a ground invasion is inevitable. For those who also aren't familiar, a lot of Israelis are talking about this deadline of September 1st, which is the back-to-school time in Israel. And because you have almost 100,000 Israelis that are evacuated from their homes in the north of Israel and can't go back until the situation calms down with Hezbollah, basically the deadline is either Israel finds a way to bring these residents back to their homes with a deal with Hezbollah by September 1st, so their kids can go back to school and learn in school, or they do it through war. And if they don't do either of those things, then what will inevitably happen is that Israeli families will start sending their kids to other schools throughout the country, and the very fabric of communities in northern Israel will just collapse at its core. So that's something of the
the deadline that has been discussed largely, that September 1st is the upper limit that Israel can go in terms of fighting against Hezbollah in South Lebanon. And if I can just say one thing about this specific assassination of this very senior Hezbollah member, I do think this is very, very significant for the fighting. Again, this is not a major strategic win. This is a very significant tactical win. Hezbollah still knows how to fight. It still knows how to give it their all. It's not as if Israel achieved some sort of game changer here that will prevent Hezbollah from fighting. But it is very important to mention about Hezbollah that it is a very hierarchical organization, and decisions are made from the top down in a very rigid way. And when you take out their top commanders, it very deeply affects their ability to function. And I think that this killing of what is parallel to a brigader-general in Western armies, the killing of this general is largely a very significant tactical gain for the Israelis. And we're going to have to see whether or not, as the American says, this is kind of further laying the ground for a ground invasion sometime in the next few months.
I mean, not only is it a tactical win as well, but it's just psychologically showing Hezbollah that, look, we can kill your senior commanders. It's, for an army, that's incredibly demoralizing. I think we'd feel the same way if Hamas or Hezbollah found a way to assassinate one of our generals as well. The IDF is not quite as rigid hierarchical as you described with Hezbollah, but that being said, having someone as a general, you wield a significant amount of knowledge and power and influence in any army.
Yeah.
From what I understand, from what the kind of the rumors going around at this point is that Israel is expected to finish the ground invasion in Rafah within the next several weeks. By that point, Israel will have considered all of Hamas's major battalions to have been decimated and disorganized, to the point where, as Michael, as you said, Israel not be able to, or Hamas, will not be able to function as a centralized entity anymore. I don't believe that for a second. I think we've already talked about that. I very much, but I'll get back to that in a second. Once that's done, once the Hamas battalions have been kind of destructured, then Israel will be able to deploy troops again to the north. They'll be able to focus almost exclusively on the north, while simply engaging in operations in Gaza in order to prevent any reconstruction of Hamas. To go back to my original point of what I predict would happen in a northern invasion. First of all, I tend to look at as I said, I kind of mentioned Vietnam once already, and I'm going to bring it up again right now. In January 1967, the Americans, from the CIA to the military to the political class, were all convinced that the North Vietnamese, the NVA, have been also decimated from a centralized position, that they were unable to cooperate or coordinate or communicate with each other, that they were essentially cells running around throughout North Vietnam. April 1967, you had the Tet Offensive, which completely changed the game. It was a massive coordinated nationwide attack by the NVA. As a tactical play, it was unsuccessful. They were repelled by the Americans and their South Vietnamese soldiers, but it was a huge moral blow to the Americans, who realized that the last 2 plus, or if you count the French as well, 12 years in Vietnam amount to nothing. That the NVA were still able to coordinate and cooperate with each other, that they were still a centrally structured organization. And for many people, they consider 1967 to be the beginning of the end of Vietnam. I think that's exactly what's going to happen in Gaza. That's just my prediction. I might be totally wrong on this one. I think it's exactly what's going to happen in Gaza should the Israelis turn their attention to the north. If I were Sinwar, I would look at this as almost like a final stand type situation, where I would do a massive coordinated attack throughout the entire Gaza Strip against IDF positions, knowing full well that I'm about to lose thousands of troops, but to show to both the Israelis and to the world that Hamas is still the same Hamas to a certain extent that it was on October 6th. In addition to that, obviously the devastation of the north. I really think with Hezbollah's missile capabilities, that this would not be like the war that we are today, where you and I are sitting, in a very comfortable air-conditioned living room recording our podcast. I would see much of Israeli society kind of Israeli economy coming to a standstill, as people are forced throughout the center, the economic powerhouse of Israel, to live underground, because essentially they'd be facing missiles that are, from what we do know about Hezbollah, that are extremely sophisticated to the point where they can evade the Iron Dome. This would kind of turn into a World War II style, fully mobilized kind of war, where every sector of the Israeli economy is dedicated to this war.
Yeah.
It's a terrifying thought, in my opinion, in addition to just the fierce fighting in southern Lebanon, which, if we compare it to 2006, I mean, ever since 2006, during the Second Lebanon War, the IDF has not made the mistake of underestimating Hezbollah again. When Hezbollah was able to get very close to the IDF and essentially nullify their air and artillery power and cause massive damage amongst Israeli soldiers. Hezbollah has only become a stronger military force since then. They are highly sophisticated in their weapons capabilities, most of whom are now armed with, for instance, things like night vision and infrared lasers. They've spent from 2014 to 2021 fighting in Syria. The Radwan unit in particular has fought shoulder to shoulder with some of the Russian special forces as well. They've learned a lot from them. They've learned a lot from the battlefield experiences they had in Syria. They're quite capable fighters. These are guys who have dedicated almost a decade of their lives now to actual warfare. They're a tremendous foe for the Israelis to engage with. And this idea of the September 1st deadline of being able to push them back behind the Litani River by that point, yes, it would certainly prevent them from being able to launch their anti-tank missiles, of which there is no defense at this point. The missiles are just too fast and from too close of a range to even get to a shelter. But it would not stop, in my opinion, Hezbollah's, not just my opinion, it would not stop Hezbollah's ability to still launch rocket attacks at Israel post September 1st.
Yeah, the only two things that it would stop, you're 100% right. The only two things it would stop is, number one, anti-tank missiles. That the furthest range that I think we've seen in a lot of these attacks are up to 8 kilometers, and that's like the most advanced anti-tank missiles. And the second would be an invasion of Radwan special forces into northern Israel. I think it would be much more difficult for them to do an October 7th styled ground invasion in northern Israel if they're pushed back many kilometers northwards. The rocket threat will always be there. Hezbollah has something like 100,000 rockets in their arsenal. They could target anywhere in the state of Israel. They could also target even beyond the state of Israel. They can target American interests in the region. They're incredibly sophisticated. They have very advanced means. And even if they didn't have any of the precision long-range weapons that we know that they have, and they just had 100,000 regular rockets, they decide to shoot, which they're capable of doing, let's say 3,000 rockets a day at the exact same location in the state of Israel, even that will overcome Iron Dome. You shoot 3,000 rockets a day exactly at the same location in Akko or in Haifa or in wherever, and you're going to take down skyscrapers. You're going to start hitting major buildings in the state of Israel and causing an enormous amount of human and economic damage. The war will be devastating for Israel. It will also be devastating for Lebanon if and when it does happen. The question of whether or not it will happen, I think, is not a logical one of whether or not this is good for Israel or good for Hezbollah. It's a deeper question of what is Bibi's interest here, because Bibi is going to be the one who's going to press the button. And I think that Bibi, if understanding the way he makes decisions and kind of putting myself in his shoes, I think that he has an interest in pushing off the invasion of Lebanon as much as he can. I think he's going to try to push it off as close as he can to that September 1st deadline in order to do something. And if he doesn't strike a deal with Hezbollah and with Hamas before September 1st, I think that he's going to go ahead and launch that invasion, because from a political perspective, this is the lifeline that he needs to keep on going just a little bit further.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think it's the way you sort of focus on Bibi and his decision making is, I agree with it. It's important to mention as well, by the way, I know it's very much summer right now. You and I, before we turn on this podcast, are both doing the stereotypical Israeli thing of just complaining about the heat. But this is an essential feature of warfare in Lebanon. It's impossible to invade Lebanon with a modern military in the colder fall and winter months as well. Any sort of major operations that take place must be during the dry season, simply because, unlike in Gaza, Lebanon is mostly composed of forest and granite mountains. Granite becomes extremely slippery when wet, to the point that tanks and other armored vehicles cannot traverse across them. So in order for the IDF to remain a fully functioning and lethal force, it will need to do this attack during the warmer months in order to push deep into southern Lebanon. I will see what remains to be seen. There certainly is a lot of calling throughout Israel. It seems that public opinion is very much for an invasion of southern Lebanon. What that would mean for should an attack take place and how that will affect the Israeli psyche, being forced to be essentially under threat in your own home for the duration of this war, I'd be curious to see if that ends up changing people's minds and change the political calculus. It remains to be seen.
Yeah.
I think at this point, it very much is as we kind of every time we talk about the North, we always sort of end it with like it's a wait and see type situation. And while it certainly does appear that an invasion is imminent, and from a military perspective would make a lot of sense to take place by the end of this month or early next month. At the end of the day, you're right. There's one guy that pushes the button, and he's operating at a very different calculus than the military generals are.
Yeah.
On that note, guys, thank you so much for listening. Hope everybody has a peaceful rest of their weekend and week, and we will speak to you all next time.